Part 2. Shady didn't sleep that night. Instead, and against his better judgment, he set off for Sundown, still under the cover of night, and still with the howls of distant timber wolves ringing in his ears. Foolish, but so was sticking around in that manor another moment longer. It was dawn by the time he arrived in Sundown. He went to a diner and nursed countless cups of coffee to try and steel his racing nerves. No matter how many times he ran the night through his head, it just made no sense. If anything, it made less. There couldn't have been any pony there. Where would they have gone? He would have seen them leaving the house or along the road. There was one way back into Sundown, and unless he'd been visited by some mystical forest-dwelling prankster, the only other explanation he had was that the strange mare was back in the house. But how? How did she get there when he'd seen her standing in the courtyard? His questions had no answers that lay within the realm of the living. Fortunately, he knew somepony who specialized in something a bit more than that. There was only one phone in the entire town of Sundown, and it was located in the train station. He wasn't surprised to find that out. Telephones are still relatively new to these parts of Equestria, and usually only able to connect towns already held together by a rail line. It cost Shady 3 bits alone just to place an outgoing call to Manhattan, but Shady supposed he couldn't exactly complain too much about the miracle that was being able to hold a conversation with some pony hundreds of kilometers away. The more ponies became bitter and unimpressed by their own advancements, the more boring life at large became. The line rang for nearly a minute, was picked up by an operator, and after Shady rattled off his transfer requests, he waited in silence for another 30 seconds before the line was picked up on the other end.
Hello?
Even with the accumulated static of half the nation clinging to her voice, Shady recognized his sister immediately. Hey, Ivory. Shady gripped the receiver tightly in both hooves. Already, his sister's family voice was beginning to calm his fraught nerves.
God, Shady, one night? You didn't last one night without me having to bail you out?
Shady chuckled. It's complicated over here.
I'd bet. How the blazes did you manage to blow all of Graham's money already?
Shady could practically hear Ivory roll her eyes through the line, though her tone was light and teasing. Nothing like that. Lace is in a lot better shape than I was worried of.
Yeah?
Ivory snorted.
I would have thought you'd have been possum food already.
Funny, Shady said bluntly. No, it's actually wildlife free. No mice, no possums. Not even any insects that I've seen.
That's weird. Isn't that place ancient?
Yeah?
Foundation older than Luna's tits?
Yep. Shady smirked at his sister's foul mouth. Mare or not, she'd always been the more brazen of the two of them. Showing every sign of rot, too.
And what's keeping all the critters out?
Ivory seemed to be reorienting herself on the other end. Shady could hear rustling, the pulling of a chair as she sat down. Shady could practically place himself right there in her Manhattan apartment with her.
Suspect you already know if you're calling me.
Just a hunch, and me thinking about what you said.
Yeah, well, I was kidding. Most ponies don't go calling a spirit medium to appraise their house for them.
Most ponies don't have easy access to one. Shady leveled. I had a weird night, Ivory.
No kidding?
Ivory sounded quite intrigued now.
What kind of something did you see? Fog and light-based? Ectoplasmic?
Shady pursed his lips, contemplating his response. Across from him, one of the ponies waiting for the train on the platform was peering over at him curiously, undoubtedly drawn in by the grave expression that had overtaken Shady's face.
Still with me, Shady?
Yeah, sorry. Fog and light, no ectoplasm that I could see. That had gotten the stranger's attention, and Shady couldn't help but blush and look away.
Moving shit around on you?
Yeah. Took my lamp and tried to lock me out of the house.
Wait, seriously?
Ivory sounded incredulous.
Shady, is this a crank call? Am I dreaming? Is it my birthday? All of those things at once? You have a poltergeist in your house?
Look, Ivory, all I know for sure is that I had a really freaky night, and I know you were kidding when you told me to tell you if I did, but... Shady sighed. Can you come by sometime soon? I'd like to not have to worry about having a ghost in my house before I start renovating it. Ivory laughed.
Philly meat candy store. Might be ecstatic, but... Shoot, hold on.
Ivory fiddled about with some papers on the other end, the sound percolating through the static as she shifted the receiver from one ear to the other.
Okay, I can't actually get down until next weekend. I'm booked solid for the next few days. You got someplace to stay until then?
Shady nodded, which he realized meant nothing at all to Ivory, so he confirmed it audibly, too. Yeah, of course. Sundown ain't Manhattan, but at least it's got a hotel. And who knows? Maybe I'll try some ghost hunting of my own. Got any recommendations for me? Ivory let out a little snort laugh.
Right, well, don't screw around too much if it's moving stuff around and slamming doors. Gotta be a pretty powerful spirit if it's doing that. As for advice, well, I'd say spread some salt around your manor if the ghost is getting too rowdy. That should scare the old hag away and keep it from bugging you.
I still can't believe I'm even having this conversation.
Me neither. Half of me thinks you've just got the jitters and you're bugging me about some nightmare you had.
I probably am.
Yeah, well, even if you are, I want to see the old haunted house myself anyway. Got an address for me to send for you yet?
Send it to Town Hall. They're holding my mail.
10-4. Illustrious real estate mogul of Sundown already got his own P.O. box.
Ivory said, a warm tone on her teasing voice.
See you in a week, Shady.
Shady said his own goodbyes and hung up the line before he got charged another 3 bits. He wasn't particularly fond of the idea of waiting a week for his sister to show up, but at the very least it would give him some time to relax his nerves and collect himself after the hellish few days he'd been having. And if any pony knew what to do about his current situation, it would be her. He couldn't afford to complain about waiting for the best pony for the job. Much as he was reluctant at the thought of spending another night in Buckwheat Manor after his eventful one last night, he eventually found himself meandering back there, after spending an hour or so more in Sundown buying some food and supplies. For all he knew, that one night would be an exception, a product of fraught nerves, like he still half suspected. And so, with his cart full of some fresh produce, cookware, and more fuel for his lamps, he began his lengthy trek back to Buckwheat Manor. As he left town, though, his sister's advice echoed back in his head once more. He hitched his cart and cantered back to the general store he had just departed from. The stallion behind the counter seemed amused. Forget something, son? Shady gave a sheepish nod. Salt. Do you sell, do you sell road salt? Road salt. The clerk stared. It's October. I know. I like to be prepared, you know? Never know when the first snowfall might creep up on you. The clerk's expression was somewhere between bewildered and amused, but thankfully he did, by some absurd luck, happen to have a few bags of road salt in a storeroom in the back of the general store. Shady gratefully bought 2, hauled them back to his cart, and set out for home once again. now with a bit more paranormal preparation. It was late in the afternoon by the time he finally returned. As he turned onto the drive leading up to the manor, he felt the same sense of foreboding stillness once more, the moment his hooves touched onto the lawn. His hooves carried him closer to the manor, which still seemed to be peering back at him through those inky, darkened voids beyond the cracked windows. The source of the sensation of stillness gradually dawned on him, though, as he approached the manor. Once he had reached it, he detached himself from the cart, leaving it by the porch for the moment, to go test out his theory. He trotted all the way back to the front gate, where he sat with his head angled upwards, watching the birds and squirrels and bugs and other living things go about their days ceaselessly. Every one of them moving about in that frantic, late autumn manner that all creatures, even ponies, felt compelled to move in as the winter drew closer. There was something strangely deliberate about the flight patterns of the birds and insects, though. They were content to perch on the trees around Buckwheat Manor, or above the road. And yet as Shady sat watching, in nearly 10 minutes, he didn't see a single one of them cross the threshold onto the grounds of the manor. If they had to get towards some point beyond, they flew around the perimeter. They took longer, far less efficient routes to get to places beyond the manor, as though dreading the notion of flying above it. The squirrels, too, would seemingly prefer to put themselves at greater risk of being snatched up by some bird of prey, traveling the lengthy way across the road instead of simply cutting across the unkempt long grasses of the manor lot. It was no wonder the entire air felt so impossibly still around Buckwheat Manor. Even the animals around it dreaded the idea of approaching it. Shady exhaled deeply. He became aware of his legs wavering and his lungs voicing their discontent. He hadn't even realized he'd been holding his breath in lengthy intervals whilst observing the forest life. What do you all know that I don't? Shady said aloud, shaking his head as he watched a squirrel prance across the rusted gate to get to the thick woods on the far side. They obviously had no insight to give him, and so Shady made his way back to go offload his cart and settle in for the evening. It was quite frustrating then for him to discover that in the time since he had parted ways with his produce less than 15 minutes ago, it had all begun to rot, as though infested with insects. All the fruits and vegetables he'd so carefully selected were now a wretched lump of foul-smelling compost, leaking onto the bottom of his cart and the newspapers he had grabbed from the general store. I think I get the hint, Shady grumbled out, half to himself, half to Buckwheat Manor, as he dumped the bag of rotted produce into the forest off to the side. A night of canned beans and peaches would have to suffice, he supposed. Night came faster than Shady would have liked. For the second time, he watched the sun fall, cold wind blowing through the woods and forcing him to retire inside to eat his dinner. A pocket knife was his utensil of choice, and he ate the peaches and beans straight out of the cans. It was hardly a meal befitting the grandiose manor around him, and he imagined in a past life the previous inhabitants would have been gawking in horror at his doing so in the midst of their library. His gaze drifted to the burnt writing on the wall. Leave our home. It was so personal, so direct. He had seen the bloody lamp floating about as it wrote it down, and he was quite certain it hadn't been held in a unicorn's telekinesis. Floating, certainly, but by something far more than simple magic. Of course the manor would have been haunted. In retrospect, it made Sunny Meadows' reaction, and the cheap and hasty sale of the house make far more sense. They no doubt expected to see him back the next morning, begging them to take the keys back so he could go back home and invest in a house that wasn't infested with wayward spirits. Shady was no quitter, though. If the irrigation system of the house needed repair, he would fix it. If it needed new shingles, he'd climb up with some fresh ones and a hammer. If the bloody manor was inhabited with ghosts, then he would evict them like the pestersome squatters they were. He stayed staring at that message, in all its crude, harsh bluntness. It's like it had been spat out at him, directly into his face. Leave our home. Buckwheats, Shady said, aloud, as though they would hear him. I'm sorry, but it's my home now. Can't we just be civil about that? The howling wind and crackling fire answered him. The manor groaned and shuddered as the old wood adjusted to the cooling night. Once Shady finished his dinner, and once the twilight outside began to thicken and darken into dusk, he dragged in one of the salt pouches he had left on the porch. He wanted a good night's sleep, and if his sister felt that this was a good idea, he'd have to give it a shot. Throwing the bag of salt over his back, Shady dug into the side with his pocket knife, forming a tiny little gash through which the salt began to slowly pour out. Then, he went on a little tour around the bottom floor of the house, spreading most of the salt at the stairs, library, foyer, and living areas where the majority of strange happenings had taken place. He had enough to cover some of the top floor, too, and so he spread some up the stairs and in the bedrooms there. It took some time, and the feeling of salt crunching under his hooves everywhere he walked was hardly pleasant. But eventually he had covered much of the manor in the stuff, no doubt to the chagrin of whatever spirit might or might not even be inhabiting the manor. It felt significantly later by the time he finished, and the moonlight was already beginning to shine through the large round window in the foyer room of the manor, casting the shadows of the railing banister onto the far wall, and catching the broken glass of the fallen chandelier. Depositing the empty salt bag, Shady locked the front door of Buckwheat Manor, took one of the newspapers he had purchased in Sundown, a little damp with rotted produce but still mostly legible, and headed upstairs to retire for the evening. The night passed in that still, placid way that nights spent with oneself often do. The sound of the wind seemed to be growing stronger as the night carried on, rustling through the trees outside, which Shady watched through the musty windows of the master bedroom. The branches wavering ever so slightly at first, but eventually dancing and bobbing and shuddering, as though a mighty beast were sauntering through the woods nearby. Rain soon joined the chamber vocals of howling wind. It splattered onto the glass and down the roof, and Shady could hear it dripping down into the study a few rooms over, too. It was hard to sleep. Shady stayed awake even as the night matured. A check of his pocket watch tucked in his nearby saddlebag told him it was past midnight. He couldn't find it in him to extinguish his lamp and close his eyes, though. And so he stayed staring at the oaken ceiling, with his ears perked up, listening to the wind and rain in the forest outside. It would have been heavenly and peaceful if it hadn't been for his fraught nerves. He supposed there were worse places in Equestria to lay awake in. And as he quickly realized, if he would have fallen asleep, then he surely would not have heard the sound of quiet sobbing from the first floor of the manor. It had blended with the rain and wind at first, Shady hadn't even been certain he'd been hearing it, and it had been soft enough that he may have missed it even without the pouring rain. Shakily, he sat up. He had to force himself to turn and look towards the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest the whole time. There was nothing there, however. As Shady was beginning to realize, there was only one spirit in Buckwheat Manor after all. He knew that the slightest movement on his behalf would bring about a cacophony of creaking boards, and so he remained motionless, with his ears perked in the direction of the hallway. They weren't fooling him. Down the stairs, in what sounded like the hallway by the stairwell leading into the cellar, he could hear the unmistakable sound of a pony's crying. To Shady, she sounded scared and confused. Perhaps even more than he was at the moment. The sobbing continued for several minutes. Sometimes it would go silent, and then start again from someplace else on the first floor. Nearby, but in a different room, and with no sound of hoofsteps or floorboards to sound out the movement of the pony. It was with dawning realization that Shady realized that the hall by the cellar's entrance, and the cellar itself, were the only places he hadn't really bothered to salt. Now it seemed to be the only place he was hearing anything at all. And even then, it sounded significantly meeker and more restrained than the activities of the previous night. Sobbing, whilst hardly moving at all. It was a far cry from the vague threats burned into the walls of his library and apparitions standing above his sleeping form. Perhaps the salt truly was working. He was half tempted to go right back to bed then and there. His sister's warnings of the dangers of paranormal beings still reverberating in his head, Shady instead began to creep his way towards the stairs, in the direction of the mare's sobbing voice. Miraculously, she didn't stop at the sound of Shady's hoofsteps, even as he visibly winced at the groaning of the floorboards. He crept down the hall, into the steps, and halfway down them he glanced over the balcony and down the hall in the direction of the sobs. It was the same mare from earlier. She was lying with her back against the wall and her limbs curled tightly around herself, weeping into them. Her face was soaked wet in blood and dripping mascara. As Shady looked closer, he saw with surprise that she, in fact, did not have any rear legs at all. Rather, her lower body seemed to resolve into a lengthy, tail-like wisp, as though she were a sea pony without any fins. Her tail, if it could be called such, was curled around herself. Shady could see her body through it, make out the glint of jewelry that seemed to be illuminated by the soft, foggy glow she emanated. The more Shady looked, the more he realized that he had seen this mare before. On the picture in the library, the one that had been desecrated. She was the young mare, the Buckwheat daughter. Leave our home. It was hard for Shady to reconcile the scrawled demand with the creature weeping before him. Against his better judgment, he cleared his throat and raised his voice. You're one of the Buckwheats, aren't you? Her sobbing stopped instantly. Her eyes went wide, ghostly black, pupilless, and peering with sheer terror in Shady's direction. She opened her mouth and paused, as though doing so had required careful thought, as though she had to reassemble some memory as to how to go about speaking. Eventually, she tried again. She locked eyes with Shady Fortune, and though she still looked terrified, she spoke with firmness all the same.
Leave our home. Please. Leave.
Shady sighed. He glanced over at the bag of salt discarded by the entrance of the door. No. I think it's you who's got to do that, I'm afraid. It's not personal, but... well, your time's passed. The mayor's expression shifted. Her fear dissipated, and anger took over. She moved out of her pathetic, fetal crying position, and instead seemed to be keen on charging headlong towards Shady. Or at the very least, she tried to. She didn't make it particularly far before her trajectory took her directly into the lines of salt that Shady had put down. She hissed out in pain, and the dull glow that hung over her wispy form grew just a little dimmer to Shady. She stumbled back, her cry splitting the silence of the manor. He was at the bottom of the stairs now. The discarded bag of salt was lying by the door, and the other still full bag beside it. He gripped the full bag in his hooves, and with a little grunt, he hauled it onto his barrel and turned back towards the ghost. She had retreated back to the presently unsalted spot in the corridor. She was glancing back at Shady with an expression intermingled with fear and fury. To Shady, she looked more like a cornered animal than any sort of equine creature, ghost or not. Her words were a steady stream now, spoken in a barely audible whisper.
Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out!
I'm sorry, Shady said. He took a wary step closer. She seemed not to hear him or see him, but he tried again. Really, I am. He gripped the bag of salt, ready to tear it open. Already, he was thinking of the morning to follow. He could call Ivory up and let her know that he had taken care of his paranormal situation all by himself, without her help, much as he appreciated her. He stopped. The ghost mare had gone silent, and was staring directly at him with her eyes widened. They were watering again, unblinking, and alight with horror. It was the look somepony got when the inevitability of death was bearing down on them. They could do nothing to prevent it. With dawning dread, Shady realized that it surely hadn't been the first time such a look had taken over this poor mare's beautiful face. Shady let the bag of salt fall onto the hall floor. What in Taurus am I doing? He whispered, looking down at the grains of salt trodden beneath his hooves. When he looked back up, the ghost of the young Buckwheat mare had gone, and he was alone once more. Somehow, Shady felt even less at peace. The rest of the night passed, with no further intrusions from the ghostly mare. Nonetheless, Shady never felt alone as the night kept going. Even if she hadn't been vocal, there was always the vague sensation that there was something just in his peripheral, down the hall, outside the darkened windows. She was avoiding him now, but she hadn't left. He had scared her off. Not just that, but it seemed as though the salt that he had spread across the manor had done an adequate job at crippling her influence. He should have felt relief. but the sight of her terrified, resigned expression as he loomed over her haunted him more than any of her intrusions so far. He apologized out loud without thinking. It seemed an odd thing to do. But the moment he saw that painting of the Buckwheat family, he couldn't stop himself. Nothing responded. The rain continued to fall. The night continued to pass. Shady didn't sleep. It was with relief that he saw the first traces of dawn light through the trees, and the pouring rain tapered away into a thin drizzle before stopping altogether. When the rain finally stopped, Shady headed outside. He boiled some water, made some oatmeal, and sat atop his cart eating it. As the morning matured, he distracted his fraught nerves by doing some work on the manor. He boarded up that patch of exposed roof, knowing full well it was probably far too late to save the room below from the worst of water damage. At least the rest of the manor wasn't so sorely affected as that one spot. The sensation of being watched, in the corner of his eye, and the reflections of the musty glass windows of the manor, never fully left. His eyes felt heavy, the culmination of 2 straight, sleepless days characterized by fear and exhaustion was beginning to weigh him down. He felt calmer inside the manor in the daytime, but he chose to nap outside regardless. The rain had stopped by the time he did so, replaced by bright and shining sun, occasionally blotted out by the clouds above. He found a spot by one of the trees in the front drive of the manor and closed his eyes. Sleep came to him laboriously slow, and he had to stop himself from opening his eyes to peer back at the manor every couple of minutes. Finally, though, sleep did come to him. His mind slowed, calmed, and eased him into dreams. It was pouring rain, and he had just managed to stumble through the front door of the manor. His wife was tearing down the stairs in an instant. Her eyes were red and puffy, but she looked at him with palpable relief as he shook the rain out of his fur and the cold from his bones.
Dear,
she cooed out, her warm hooves wrapping around him as she nuzzled her snout into his neck. Her horn was alight in a moment, stripping off the rain-soaked overcoat, while she hurriedly led him towards the crackling fireplace in the library.
You're okay. Thank goodness. You're okay.
I'm okay, my love. He smiled as she practically forced him to sit by the fire. But I fear my search. A great weariness overcame him. His gaze grew solemn as he looked into perennial Buckwheat's widened, anxious eyes. Thunder rolled outside, filling the silence as he struggled for the words. Gently, he took her hoof in his, gripping it tightly. Already, her eyes were beginning to water. He knew this part would be difficult for her, but he had to push forth all the same. I found their carriage, he said softly, looking away as her gaze deepened. It had been... There is no mistaking it. It had been clawed open by timber wolves. I could practically smell their oaken stench through the rain. Perennial's breath caught as she let out a single choking sob, but did not interrupt him. I searched, my love. Even as the rain turned to storm, I searched. I screamed for your mother and your father, louder than even the thunder above. I searched far beyond where they had been forced to abandon their wagon. And I found where hoofprints in the mud ceased, and the Prince of Timberwolves took their place. Perennial was crying now, openly. The infernal sound. He wanted to slap the bloody racket out of her throat, but he forced a patient frown instead, gripping the mare's hoof tighter. It seemed to, at the very least, shut her up for the moment. There was a great struggle, it seems. I could see the scattered remains of timber, the broken hilt of your father's blade, the torn remnants of your mother's summer hat, that wondrous one that she bought in the city. But though I searched tirelessly, I could not find them. I'm so sorry, my love. Her sobs returned, more intensely, but muted, as she sunk herself into his barrel to weep. He stroked her mane softly, as her chest heaved and her tears joined the rain dripping off his coat. He let her weep as long as she wished, long into the night. His eyes traveled to the great painting hung in the library of the 4 then surviving Buckwheats. One may as well have put a great slash through it, directly through the painted smiles of the wealthy family for all the relevance it had now. The only pony left who would truly have cared seemed too busy sobbing into his cold barrel to have noticed. Outside, through the rain and thunder and crying wind, a lone timberwolf howled out. To him, it was like a triumphant song. There was something else, being carried on the wind outside, too. A mare's voice, drifting in through the glass windows. A single word or a name, spoken in increasing volume.
Shady. Shady. Shady!
He started awake to the sight of Sunny Meadow looking down on him.
Ah!
Ah! She blinked.
Somepony's a heavy sleeper. Rough night?
He groaned, sitting up and managing a little smile. Guess so. Somehow the grass is comfier than my cot. What's up, Sunny? Sunny chuckled.
Just a courtesy call. Making sure you're in one piece and your first few nights in your lovely new home have been treating you well.
Oh, yeah. Shady waved a hoof. Totally uneventful. There seemed to be something about Shady's tone that Sunny picked up on, almost immediately, because her glance went immediately back to the manor.
You know, you can just tell me. I won't judge.
At that, Shady went silent, looking back at Sunny's face. True to her word, her expression was one of apparent warmness and sympathy. She settled down onto the grass beside him. Can I, Shady sighed. Can I ask you something I probably should have asked you earlier?
I don't know if I've got an answer, but sure.
Shady smiled, despite everything. You've been in Sundown for a while, right, Sunny?
My whole life. And I've been working with the city for about 15 years now, so yeah, I'd say I have.
Do you know what happened to the Buckwheats before they moved? That seemed to garner some reaction from Sunny. Not of surprise or frustration. It looked to Shady as though she had been expecting this question for some time and had been mentally preparing for it about as long.
That's long before my time,
She exhaled heavily.
Just that they apparently had the worst run of luck of any family in or out of Sundown's probably seen, if the old mare's tales are to be believed,
she replied. Shady thought of the young Buckwheat mare, the ghost. He thought of her terrified, pleading face. Murder? Sunny shook her head.
Not unless you think timber wolves, freak accidents, and equine grief can have malicious intent. Their youngest got caught in a brush fire when he was no more than 10, poor colt. Then the other two, timberwolves got them both. There was no road back in those days, and I guess they got turned around in a storm heading back in from town.
Shady felt as though a great weight was being placed on his chest. It seemed Sunny noticed it too, because she went silent for several moments. When she spoke, her voice was a little more than a whisper.
What did you see, Shady?
He didn't answer. He couldn't. He was quite convinced that, much as she said otherwise, there was simply no way Sunny was going to believe him. It was one thing to claim he saw some paranormal nonsense on his first nervous night in town. It was quite another to claim he had seen the past through some bloody daydream of his. She would think he was mad for certain. Then again, maybe she wouldn't. What about the mare? Perennial, the daughter?
She stayed in the place with her husband for a while, after her folks died,
Sunny said.
But apparently she wasn't quite right. Reclusive, angry, at herself, at the world. Her husband did all the shopping and was the only one who ever went into town. She drowned herself in the lake beyond the trees there, behind the house. Did it a year after her parents died. Guess her husband sold the place after that.
Shady was quiet. His head felt like it was spinning.
Shady,
Sunny opened her mouth and closed it again, as her thought died momentarily. Her eyes fell flat on her head.
We should have told you. Guess we thought you must have already known.
No, not your fault. Shady shook his head. I was the one who looked at the damn haunted house outside of town and said, yes, that's where I want to put up a bloody picket fence. Sunny managed to chuckle.
You okay, though? You looked kinda...
I'm fine, now that I know, he said, nodding. It's just, well, you see all those old paintings of all these old ponies and it messes with you. You asked me if I had a rough night, and I guess I did. Nightmares. Didn't sleep. Guess I'm at that perfect age where I'm not quite a young stallion anymore. All full of existentialism. Sunny laughed again.
Hey, if you're not quite young, I'm ancient history, whippersnapper.
They shared another laugh, and Sunny took her leave shortly thereafter. When she did, Shady headed back towards Buckwheat Manor with renewed vigor. His mind was aglow with images of his ghostly intruder, huddled sad and afraid in a darkened corner of the manor, scared and confused, and an intruder to what should have been her home. He found an ancient straw broom in the kitchen of the manor, and he set to work. Every grain of salt he had deposited onto the hardwood floor to deter the spirit, he swept all up. He worked tirelessly, well into the afternoon, cleaning up his efforts from the previous day. Once he gathered it all and tossed it into the forest outside. The deer could enjoy it, for all he cared. Once he finished, he stood in the foyer, looking up at the second-floor landing, while the motes of dust swirled and danced through the beams of light descending from the windows. "I'm sorry," he said aloud to the empty house. I was so wrong. If you can hear me, perennial Buckwheat, I'm sorry." Nothing responded. Shady wasn't surprised. He hadn't seen much evidence of the ghost in any of his daytime ventures through Buckwheat Manor. Her influence, certainly, but she herself did not seem to like appearing while the sun and light reigned over the skies above. He would have to wait until night again to make his amends with the mare, to try and understand and make peace. He had grown up his entire life thinking that the ghostly spirits that remained in the world of the living had their own evil aims. His sister, as much as he loved her, had further convinced him of that. When his grandmother had joined the blurred, half-remembered faces of his mother and father in Elysium, or so he was told, he'd felt it greater than ever. Her good spirit had moved on, found peace. The sinister, ghastly ones that remained here in Equestria would never know such peace. But now Shady was starting to realize that within the halls of Buckwheat Manor was a scared, lonely, long-lost soul. Just like him. And if he deserved peace, then why shouldn't she?